Welcome to MyLife Chassidus Applied, episode 523. This program is in loving memory of Miriam Bas Eliyahu, Altes Aleha Shalom, and in merit of Baruch Binyamin ben Menucha Lana Altes, Yukusil ben Lei Rochel and Rochel Bas Liba Farkash, dedicated by Pinchas Todres ben Miriam and Sarah Bas Rochel Altes. So we're at the beginning of the month of Kislev, Chodesh geulah, we call it, due to the geulah of Tes Kislev. Before that, the geulah of Kislev. Tes Kislev is the birthday and yahrzeit of the Mitteler Rebbe, which we shall discuss. There's also Untitled Kislev in this month, the 14th of Kislev, the anniversary of the Rebbe and the Rebbeim. Rosh Chodesh Kislev, which we discussed last week. And of course, the conclusion of the month is with Chanukah, the geulah from our enemies and from the darkness of the time. So its message could not be more relevant to the events happening today, with the Jewish people and Israel under attack, fighting enemies, both in Eretz Yisrael and abroad. So there are many lessons we can learn from this particular time of the year, this month, including this week's Parsha, and we'll cover all of that. I think a good place to begin is just the most latest news, latest breaking news with the downfall of President Assad of Syria, which, when you think about it, is all part of a bigger narrative, not just today, but throughout history, but especially in the last year, as things have accelerated in the battles there in the Middle East, especially around Eretz Yisrael. And we've talked about this a number of times, citing the Midrashim, the Zohars. The Rebbe quoted many of them in the time of the Persian Gulf War and throughout different periods when we were facing similar confrontations. So there's so much to be learned, and above all, to be gleaned lessons, strength, confidence, and hope that though there's pain involved and loss, and lives have been shattered, lives have been taken, they're hostages, but in the bigger picture, we know and we're absolutely confident that it will lead to the geulah hamitis v'ashlema. And these confrontations, these battles, are all predicted. Not predicted, God forbid, necessarily that it should cause so much pain and loss, but that there would be confrontations. And they began in the house of Avram Avinu, with Avram having his son Ishmael and Yitzchak, and then in the house of Yitzchak, Esau and Yaakov, it's two nations at war with each other. And in this week's Parsha, it comes to a conclusion with Jacob and Esau reconciling. However, not complete reconciliation. It begins with almost war, it ends up not being a war, but ends up still need to be resolved. And we'll discuss all of this in this week's program because specifically its relevance to our times. So let's begin with the most immediate question that has already been coming in since last night already and this morning, and I will address it. How should we react to the downfall of President Assad in Syria? So, as a Torah Eden, as Jews that follow the Torah, and especially Chassidus Pnimis HaTorah, whenever we see an event in the world, we look at it through the eyes of Torah. What is Hashem telling us here? What is the bigger Hashgacha Pratis? Obviously, you can't ignore the fact that Syria has been an ally of Iran, maybe a proxy of Russia. They say now President Assad has run off to Russia and has gotten political asylum there. So you see, it's a connection not just to one country, it's a connection to bigger countries and to the whole region. You also can't ignore that it's coming right in the wake of the battles with Hamas in Gaza, with Hezbollah in Lebanon, and of course Iran always right in the middle of it all. So when you look at it from that perspective, and I'm not talking now from a military point of view or a political point of view, more of a cosmic point of view, it's clearly all part of the final battles between the Bnei Ishmael and that part of the world with the West, and specifically with Israel. which has been, as I said, predicted in Midrashim that are hinted to in different psukim. I mentioned in the Maimorim of the Friedrich Rebbe of Tovshin Tes, 1949, based on the Maimorim of the Rebbe Rasha Pesach Tofrei Samaches, which is 1908, you have essentially that the last birur would be the birur of Ishmael and Esau. And when you look in the Zohar, Sefer Parshas Vayishlach, you find as well that there will be at the end of the days battles between the Arab Muslim countries. It doesn't say the Arab Muslim, but it says that part of the world. And they will challenge each other, and then challenge the West, and there'll be wars. And ultimately, it will come the geulah. So when you think of it from that perspective, you see that there's a bigger picture unfolding here. Now, we of myopic vision don't necessarily always see the bigger picture, but the Rebbe spoke about it during the Persian Gulf War. I quoted the Yalkut Shmeini, which can definitely be applied to events today. Above all, what does the Yalkut Shmeini say? My children, don't be afraid. It says it to all people. People are running around the world all in chaos and upheaval. What's going on? But then when the Yidden are running, Hashem says, don't be afraid. I'm doing it all for you. This doesn't mean that we shouldn't act. Obviously, we need to act militarily and whatever other way necessary. But we have to also realize that there's an unfolding story. So generally speaking, we can say the downfall of an enemy of the Jewish people, of Israel, a dictator, an enemy perhaps of his own people as well, is a positive thing. We have to also understand every vacuum creates new challenges, because who knows who takes over. Like some people say, the known evil is better than the unknown evil. But we have to look at every type of transition of this nature, disruption, I would say, as an opportunity. And so the general response would be, the reaction should be a type of, we'll call it healthy and discretionary optimism, meaning we have to do what we have to do, but we have to think of it as an opportunity. Can this be turned into something positive? That the whole region should make peace with Eretz Yisrael, with the Yidden, just as the Abraham Accords did. Can that spread? And can we finally eliminate all those dark forces, beginning with Iran and its proxies, and Hezbollah and Hamas and the Houthis, being that Syria was sponsored and supported by also enemies of Israel? Perhaps this is part of that darkness slowly fading away. But we have to be prudent and practical, meaning we have to deal with what we have, and we'll see who's going to come into power. And often in these type of situations, things can get worse before they get better. But al tiftach peh, we have to think positively. So that's the overall reaction. We look at it as a bigger picture. And we hope for the best, and we pray for the best, and we hope this is what God is saying, that ultimately your enemies will turn on each other, because it was not anyone else but Syrians themselves that rebelled against their leader. And that will turn into a positive and yet another element of victory. And Israel has to become even stronger, because it vindicates what they've been doing, weakening Hezbollah, weakening Hamas. And perhaps that contributed to the courage that these rebels had to rise up against Assad and overall against his hosts and supporters, namely Iran and Russia. So that is the general approach. Is this a positive move forward? As I said, a positive move forward, very possible. I would say yes, because whenever you see chaos in a regime that is not a healthy regime, is not a regime that is advocating freedom, advocating peace, that controls its citizens, in general, that's a move forward. But we have to also realize, as I said, vacuums create its own challenges. But we have to be vigilant. When I say we, Israel, the Western world, hopefully the United States. Some people say this is part of the Trump effect, that people see that it's not going to be ignored. While Biden was president, most of this was all ignored and nothing was really done. So people could feel they can do whatever they want. And maybe now there's a certain type of we better get our act together. We don't know what Trump is going to do. I'm sure all this contributes. So we have to think of it again in a positive way. Should we be celebrating or should we be concerned? As one person writes, should we celebrate the overthrowing of the evil dictator Assad of Syria, or should we be worried that the rebels who overthrow him contain battalions of ISIS and other terrorist groups that are even worse than Assad? Some say they associate with Al-Qaeda, but we've also seen some videos of these rebels saying we would like to make peace with Israel. So the jury's out. We'll see. We have to be vigilant and see what we have to do. But in that sense, I don't know if celebrating is our job to celebrate. Our job is to watch carefully and hope for the best, and do whatever we can to make sure this is a forward progress toward a peaceful region. That ultimately, when there'll be peace in the Middle East and peace with Israel, what better keli, what other better channel is there for the geulah itself? What are its bigger cosmic implications? So we'll talk about that now. So first, there's a Midrash going around. I'm sure you've seen it from Midrash Rashbi. It's called at the end there, where he says, he quotes there about different things that will happen year by year, and then he says at the end, "V'zelecha ha'is," and here's a sign. Here's for you a sign. Kashatereya shenofal nirein mizrachi shebedamesek. When you'll see that the eastern Nero in Damascus will fall, Malchus b'nei Mizrach, Nofla Malchus b'nei Mizrach, the Malchus, the kingdom of b'nei Mizrach, of the people of the east, va'oz titzmach HaYeshua liYisrael, and then that will sprout and give birth to Yeshua, salvation for Israel. Mashiach ben David ba v'yalu liYerushalayim v'yisangu aleha. Mashiach ben David will come, and they will rise up to Yerushalayim v'yisangu aleha, and take pleasure upon it, upon Yerushalayim. Shenemar v'novim yirsha orez v'yisangu al rev shalom. That's how it concludes. So what you have here clearly in Damascus, that when there'll be a fall in Damascus, it's a sign that Mashiach will come. Very, very much echoes the Baal HaTurim that I quoted at the end of Parshas Vayishlach, where he says, Al Pnei Ochav Yipol, talking about Ishmael, that when Bnei Ishmael will fall, will then be Ela Tel this Yitzchak, who's Tel this Yitzchak, Ben Peretz, Mashiach, that will come from the children of Yitzchak after the fall of Ishmael. So it has a very similar ring to it. Now, what does exactly means Nira Mizrachi? So Nira was, of course, the King Nero in Rome. And so this sounds like the east, the Nero of the east, meaning referring to the Nero of Syria, of Damascus, which can be referred to either different individuals that led Syria, or could even talk about Syria today. Nofla Malchus b'nei Mizrach also seems to suggest the east, which is, of course, Syria. Perhaps there's some other meanings in all of this, but it's pretty clear that this clearly is reflective in events today. We have to always be careful when we quote a Midrash, because Midrashim are many. I quote it with somewhat responsibility because I saw the Rebbe quoting the Yalkut Shmeini. So similar statements seem to all come together when you see the larger narrative. Now, with that, I think it's a good segue to go into Parshas Vayishlach, because Parshas Vayishlach is essentially a continuation of this story as well, as we shall discuss. So what do we learn from Parshas Vayishlach? Okay, so Parshas Vayishlach, of course, is the conclusion of a story that began in Parshas Teldes. So 2 weeks ago, we hear about Teldes, as just mentioned, Teldes Yitzchak, the children of Yitzchak, Jacob and Esau, Hamurim B'Parsha, that I talked about in the Parsha, through the eyes of Torah, are the two children, the twins, that are carried by Rivka in her womb, struggling within her womb. And she discovers, and she's told, that these are two nations within you, and they will be at each other's throats. Yes. L'umalum yemech, kam zen nofal. When this one will rise, this one will fall. Literally the same words that we're seeing here. Fall, rise, the rise and fall of nations. And indeed, we see Jacob and Esau are born, antithetical characters, personalities. Yaakov is Ish Tom Yeshiv Aholim, the wholesome one, the pure one, the innocent one, the dweller of tents, scholar. And Esau is Ish Sayed, Ish Melcham Yedid Sayed, a warrior, man of war, a hunter, a master of hunting. And these are two archetypes, both within ourselves, the divine soul and the animal soul, and within the nations of the world, the confrontations which will take place from the grandchildren of Esau, namely Rome, Nero, Rome, as well as which is Magdiel Zuremi, a grandson of Esau's, with the children and grandchildren of Yaakov. Wars that have been fought. The wars of Rome as it conquered, Malchus Edom conquered Yerushalayim, destruction of the Second Temple, the geulah Edom that we're still in till today. The wars of the Christians and the Crusaders and so on against the Jewish people. And so Yaakov and Esau represent that. That's in Parsha tells us. Parshas Vayishlach, Yaakov is coming back now from Lavan after building his family. 20 years. He doesn't know what's the story with Esau. What's the story with Esau? So he sends malachim. He sends messengers or actual angels to see. And they tell him Esau is marching with 400 men. So he sees clearly Esau is not ready to make peace. Chassidus explains that Yaakov thought Esau may have already been isbared. He may have already been refined and ready to make total peace. Because Yaakov always knew that his battle with his brother was a deeper story, a cosmic story. And that ultimately there would be peace. That's geulah. The Rebbe speaks about it in a number of places where he talks about Yaakov thought that Esau was already finished and we could march to the geulah. But that wasn't to be the case. So that's when Yaakov prays, prepares a bribe to appease Esau, as well as obviously preparing for war. So thank God he didn't need war, because once he met Esau, and with his bribe, with his appeasement, they hug and embrace the different opinions. Was it a complete embrace or not a complete embrace? But war for sure not. To the point that Esau then says to Yaakov, come, let's live side by side. Yaakov sadly realized that we're not ready to live side by side. So he says, Visnal, you go ahead, Visnal li'iti, Yove adenia se'era, I will come, and we will live side by side. Rashi explains, what do you mean, what does that mean? He knows that he's not going. So he means when Mashiach will come, will be V'hoisel Hashem Amlucha, the Teda of Avadja, which concludes, V'hoisel Hashem Amlucha, when there will be total peace between Yaakov and Esau. So he knew it wasn't then to be, but it would be in time. And history is the story of this battle between Yaakov and Esau. The plot thickens, however, because Ishmael is still not disappeared. We know that from the Matan Teda. Hashem offers the Teda to Bnei Ishmael and to Bnei Esau. We also know that Esau marries the daughter, Bosmas, Mochlas, of Ishmael. Indeed, the Barbanel, and we're talking now thousands of years later, the Barbanel in Spain, in his commentary on Daniel, when he talks about the confrontations in his time between the Christians and the Muslims, which basically the Romans, the Western world, and Christians with the Arab Muslims and the Jewish people. And he cites an interesting Midrash, a Midrash about the marriage between Ishmael, Bas Ishmael, and Esau. So when Esau hears from his parents that they're telling Yaakov to go find the Shidduch in Charan and find where, from the family of Avram Avinu, so he decides, you know what, I'll do the same. And he goes and decides he's going to marry the daughter of Ishmael, the son of, basically granddaughter of Avram. It comes the day of the chuppah, and what happens? It's him and Ishmael, the zukünftiger Edom, so to speak, son-in-law with his prospective father-in-law, sit down to negotiate a nadan, a dowry. And Esau, a very shrewd man, says to his potential grandfather-in-law, says to him, you know what, I have an idea. Our grandfather Abraham was a tremendous usher, very wealthy. You kill your brother Yitzchak, who you dislike. I'll kill my brother Yaakov. So we alone will be left with the entire fortune of our grandfather Avraham Avinu. We don't have to share it with them. Says the Midrash that Ishmael, who was not a slouch himself, says to Esau, Haloi Kayin anochi? You think I'm like Kayin, that's going to kill Hevel, his brother? Ishmael was a Talmud Chacham too, just like Esau, a scholar. He knew that if he kills Yitzchak, so then Esau has a mitzvah of geulah adam. He has to now avenge his father's blood, Yitzchak, his blood. And then he'll kill Ishmael under the pretense of a halacha nachech, and then he'll be left with a fortune with the same logic. You know, the one who plots with you against someone else is going to end up plotting against you. So he says, so Ishmael says, no, I'm not doing it. Esau, if that's the case, I'm not marrying your daughter. So they left a bride under the chuppah, crying probably. Maybe not, I don't know. But later, after Ishmael passes away, dies, Esau takes her, and that's why the name changes. Says the Barbanel that the problems with Bnei Ishmael and Bnei Esau is not just individually, it's this marriage. Because once Ishmael, Bnei Ishmael, and Bnei Esau come together in a marriage, the genetic pool, I'm adding to that, gets more complex. And now you have to deal with both challenges, the Ishmael challenge and the Esau challenge. So that just turns the last birurim even more profound. So I was thinking about, Niran Sheba Mizrach in the east. So you have the Nero of Rome, and there's the Nero in the east in Damascus. How does it all work together? Perhaps that's what the Midrash is hinting to. The fact of the matter is, how would the equation be different if the Western world was not so dependent and therefore bound together with the oil of the Arab countries? So that definitely had an impact. It had an impact back during the Yom Kippur War in the early 70s. I'm sure it has impact on different negotiations. So the plot is still a complicated one, but when you start seeing it get weaker, and that's what this Pasha tells us. The Jacob and Esau, even though it was not bitter, the geulah were not ready for the geulah yet, but the bitter had begun. And that's why Esau did embrace Jacob. Not completely, but not permanently. And ultimately, the Pasha is telling us the story will come to fruition. And indeed, when you look at the Sikha of Vayeshev Tavshinun Beis, you really see it come alive. There, the Rebbe briefly says it's a Sikha that is one of the most historical, most far-reaching in its implications. Check it out, Vayeshev Tavshinun Beis. Rebbe talks about Faratzta, Tzarfas, which of course is a Western world, a Western country. In the Western world, that is connected to the Bnei Esau, Edom. That when it came to the war between Alexander and Napoleon, the Franco-Russo War, that ended in 1812. So the Alter Rebbe, in contrast to some other Gedolim, wanted Alexander to win the war. Not because Alexander was such a great man. He hated Jews. But he felt that under Alexander it would be more difficult physically for the Jews, but spiritually it would be better, healthier for them. Under Napoleon, physically it would be easier because he promised freedom, fraternity, democracy, but it would be godless. As the Alter Rebbe writes in a famous letter, and the Mitteler Rebbe elaborates, that Napoleon, Bonaparte he calls him, represented godlessness. And godlessness, even with Alexander winning, look what assimilation did. So the Alter Rebbe prevailed, the famous story with blowing shofar early on Rosh Hashanah that year. Alexander did win, even though Bonaparte, Napoleon, was literally on the doorstep, but the Russian winters humbled him, as they would later do to the Nazis, Yamach Shemam. So it was the best of the best of the worst, Alexander, because the Alter Rebbe felt that going into the world of France, of the West, the Jewish people were not ready yet, and they would not be able to deal with those freedoms, even though the freedom itself is a blessing. Says the Rebbe. But that was then, 7 generations later, that was then, like Yaakov recognized he can't yet live side by side with Esau. It would be too threatening because the children are young and the sheep are tender. But 7 generations later, the Rebbe says, from the Alter Rebbe, Der Ashvi, now we see we've already gone to Tzarfas, and the Rebbeim start sending shluchim there, and the Rebbe even alludes to himself and the Rebbetzin living there. Chassidus started spreading there. Now we have the power to be Mavarer Esau. Tzarfas, and turned Tzarfas into Faratzta. Gematria 770. The Rebbe talks about the nigun of Aderes V'Amuna, the transformation that the Rebbe created through taking what? The nigun of Tzarfas. It's anthem. It's national anthem, the Marseille, and turning it into Aderes V'Amuna L'chaya Elomin. To see the sikha, it's unbelievable. And bottom line is that now we're ready to be Mavared Esav. So what Yaakov thought thousands of years ago, that he thought Yosef was Nizbared, ultimately that would happen. And V'hoisel Hashem Amlucha. So when you look at now events today, you say, and the Rebbe said this already, Tafshin Beis, we're talking about now 32 years ago, 33 years ago. Vayeshev will be 33 years from that sikha. Tafshin Pei Hei. That for sure we're even closer to that period. So when you see these events, the cosmic implications are very, very clear. And you add the Midrashim into it, and the Zoyars and everything else I mentioned, it's very clear where we're at. But that doesn't mean we don't lock our doors, and doesn't mean we don't have to develop all the military strategy, just like Yaakov prepared. We still have some enemies. There's still the gasps of the Lumas, the final gasps of the other side of the enemy is still there. But we have to understand that the picture is unfolding, and we're literally at the threshold of the geulah amitis v'ashlema, where there'll be a total reconciliation with Esav and with Ishmael too. And that when Hashem offered the Torah to Bnei Ishmael and Bnei Esav, and at the time they rejected it, but as the Zohar says, that Tzemach Tzedek discusses, we've talked about this in this program as well, that ultimately they would accept the Sheva Mitzvahs Bnei Neach. And they would live at peace, and it will be Oz Epech Elam himself a Brura. As the Rambam concludes Sefer Ayad, Molor is Deus Hashem Kamayim Layam Echasim Lo Yerei V'Lo Yashchisu B'chol HaKodshi, because Lo Ye'esa Kol Elam El L'Dases Hashem Bovad. There will be a world filled with divine knowledge, and therefore there will not be any more evil or destruction. So we need to know that as well, and do whatever we can, both for ourselves, our families, our communities, anyone you can reach, and share with them this idea, which essentially is the message of this month of Kislev too, as we'll talk about some more shortly. The message of what? The message of that darkness, even a lot of darkness, is dispelled by a little light. The story of Chanukah, story of Tes Kislev, and the story of Yud Kislev and Tes Kislev, as shall be discussed. So you see in Parshas Vayishlach, you see the seeds of the characters and all the events and the narrative that would unfold, and then now it's taken on a whole new shape and form, because now you're dealing with billions of people that represent these different archetypes, the Lu'um Alum Yemots, and throw Yishmael in as well, and the combinations. So the fall of nations that represent the antithesis to godliness is a step forward in this direction. Okay. So, since there are a few more questions about Parshas Vayishlach, I might as well deal with that. And then we'll talk about Tes and Yud Kislev. And we'll see how much time we have. So, wasn't Jacob the true firstborn? This takes us back to the bracha. The brachas that Yaakov, some people took from Esau. Before that, the Bechera, the firstborn, in Parsha tells us. So we discussed at length how he was able to do that. Dressing up in the garments of Esau. What does that mean? That it's all about dressing up in the garments of this world, because although Esau is also a child of Yitzchak and Rivka, and ultimately would be part of the big blessing, but the guf, the gashmias of this world, does not yet understand that, and has to be channeled through the neshama of Yaakov. Someone wrote a practical question that says, why do we criticize it even? Why do people ask this question? Some people criticize Yaakov for buying the birthright from Esau and for tricking Yitzchak into giving him the blessings. But isn't it a fact that Yaakov was supposed to be born first, and Esau fought with Yaakov in the womb and jumped out first? That's why Yaakov was grabbing his heel to stop him. So ultimately, Yaakov didn't do anything wrong by taking the blessings. He just took back what should have rightfully been his if Esau didn't forcefully jump out first. This person also adds, interesting note, it's kind of the same thing with Israel. It's been our land for 3,500 years. We were forced out into the diaspora and had the land stolen from us. Now they're complaining when we are reclaiming our land and they are accusing us of stealing it. Or in the words like Rashi says, that Kaddish Baruch Hu is the one, God created the world. And yes, he gave the land, and then he says, I take the land, and I gave this part of the land to the Yid. So, but you have to keep in mind, but Esau did come out first, despite the attack of the battle. The battle is, at the end of the day, to use language from Chassidus, is the Yesh HaNivra, the Geshem itself, is rooted in its Yusim Atzmusi of the Yesh HaMiti of Atzmus. However, on its own, it turns into a Yesh of Aniv Avsied, me and nothing else. And it needs the Neshama, Ner Hashem Yishu B'Sam, the light of the Neshama, and the light of Torah, to direct and harness the body. That the body should understand that its Yeshus is coming from Atma, not from itself. Esau was not on that level yet. Losid Love, the Yesh will recognize that. But till that point, that's why it has to go through Esau, through Yaakov. But at the end of the day, there is an element in Esau that does have a mile. Like it says in Chassidus, that the root of Toyu is higher than, the root of Esau in Toyu is higher than the root of Yaakov and Tikkun. The Mamorim of Torah in Vayishlach. But it has to be revealed. And for that, Tikkun has to reveal it. So that's the additional point I would make here. Okay. So let's deal with two more things in this parsha. Why was Jacob silent when hearing that Dinah was violated? When he heard that Dinah was violated. So writes it in a more elaborate way. Let me read it. Reb Simon, in this week's parsha we are taught about the story of the rape of Dinah, the violation of Dinah, let's call it. First, an observation. When Yaakov comes to the city of Shechem, he pays big money for a field. Later, Shechem, the violator, uses this as in an argument to Dinah. Your father spent big money buying me one small field. If you agreed to marry me, you'd be the lady of the entire city of Shechem. We see from here that in the Middle East, if you get bullied into overpaying for property, you're perceived as weak and that your daughters are there for the taking. Okay, I understand the lesson you're taking from that. Fine, I'm not going to comment on that. Now a question. Yaakov is silent. That's what it says. The pasuk says he was silent when he's told of Dinah's being violated. When his sons come, he remains silent as they tell Shechem and Chamer that they'll agree to intermarry of the men of Shechem, all circumcised. Then, however, when Shimeon and Levi act upon the plan and kill all the men, Yaakov gets upset. Why was Yaakov silent? Why did he let his sons answer for him? What did Yaakov think his son's answer meant? Did he really think that they'd intermarry, or did he realize it was a ploy? If he thought that they'd really do it, meant marry, what does that teach us? If he knew it was a ploy, then why did he get upset when the ploy was carried out? We're told Ein Yankov, but here we don't see Yaakov take a leadership role and only criticizes after others do lead. Why? Okay, let's address these questions. So first of all, the question of Yaakov's silence is addressed by several commentaries. If you really look at the pasuk, he says he was silent, waiting for them to return. It doesn't just say he was silent, which hints to the fact that he was waiting for them, either to discuss it with them, or to see what they think, see what they would do. So you have to realize that this was more complicated than just he was silent. That's one explanation, that he was relying on them, or wanted to talk to them about it. Another thing that comes to mind, where do we find another person being silent? Vayidim Adon, when his sons tragically died, Kaddish Kadoshim, Nadav and Avihu, it says Vayidim Adon, he was quiet, silent. It's a different word than what it says here. So you could say the silence was not a paralysis, it was shocking to him, and he was extremely disturbed by it. So his silence, what was he going to say? So silent does not necessarily mean detached, and silent definitely does not mean paralyzed. It could be totally shocked. He took it so personally. Now the question is, did he agree with what Shimeon and Levi did? So on one hand, yes, he did rebuke them. And later in the brachas, he talks about it, he hints to Shimeon and Levi, because he understood where aggression can go. But you could argue that he was against aggression in general, and he knew that Shimeon and Levi can be very aggressive, but geulah sometimes is necessary. You're dealing with an enemy, you think Yaakov didn't understand you have to go to war. I mean, he himself prepared for war. So he was not a passive individual. So you could say what he was so-called criticizing was the potential of using geulah when it's out of line. But here, per se, it may have been acceptable. That's why you don't see a black and white, right and wrong here. Was it the right thing or not the right thing? Because there are a lot of other factors that have to be taken into account. You could also say that Yaakov may have said, look, it's not something I can do or the others, but this is a Shimeon and Levi thing. So somewhat like by Pinchas, halach ve'emeidin kain, this is what you do, but you can't make it a heirah for everybody. So it's a one-time event, and that was what was done. The Torah does tell, remember, Shimeon and Levi were shvatim, shiftei yudke. So you can't say what they did was entirely a crime. And you could understand it. Is it the right punishment? Remember, this is before Matan Torah, so it's not the same type of due process. But did they violate Dinah? And therefore they showed them what happens when you violate our sister, a daughter of Yaakov. So when you think of the whole picture here, it's a little more complicated than just Yaakov standing on the side. A lot of ways to look at the picture. The relevance, of course, to us is that when we're faced with adversity, we also have to always have discretion. You don't just act impulsively. You have to think it through. Therefore, you have to plan it and strategize and say, what's the right approach to take to all of this? Sometimes you need a lot of strength. If you don't show strength, that alone could open up the door for more crime. And there are other times you need to show compassion. And we have to always keep that in mind. There's no black and white solution here. And that's why Shimeon and Levi, you could say that what they did there may have been justified, but it doesn't mean every situation you do the same thing. So the fact that the Torah is discretionary about it and talks about it in a way you can see with a certain balance, on the contrary, that demonstrates that it wasn't just zealous behavior, just extreme impulsive behavior or vengeance alone. It was calculated. And there may have been different opinions among them. What's wrong with that? And then what happened is what happened. So that's a lesson that we learn from this. On the contrary, it's quite admirable at the end of the day because it was definitely discussed and looked at from very different angles. And sometimes you do things that are not pleasant, but the only way to prevent, who knows what Shechem would have done had there been no retribution. Okay. So with that, let's talk, before I get to Tes and Kislev, addressing fears. How do we abolish harsh decrees? So there was some follow-up from last week's program, which I want to address now. On a recent broadcast, so how do you abolish harsh decrees? On a recent podcast, you explained a viewer's question about the Rebbe Rashab quoting Shabbos, the Gemara in Shabbos 119b, saying that whoever says omein yehei shmei rabba with all their might, or as Rashi comments, with all your powers of contemplation, b'chol kavanose, can nullify harsh decrees. Korolig zardin. If I understand correctly, your explanation was that if someone can contemplate the great name of Hashem, then put themselves in a space above Seder Shtalshalus, the cosmic order, in God's essence, there's no concept of evil, less smaller b'hayatika, yeah. So no negative. So naturally there can be no harsh decrees there, or the abolishment of the harsh decree, and transforming it into chesed, into rachamim, to kindness and compassion. My question is this: is this just an exercise in the spiritual world, or in a place above the concept of worlds, or is there a way to manifest this into the physical world and actually take negative decrees and nullify them? For example, if someone has a severe illness, God forbid, that came to their body due to a harsh heavenly decree, and they say, omein yehei shmei rabba, the proper way, can negate the decree, and then their physical body would automatically heal? The answer is yes. That's exactly what it means. But remember, like with everything, prayer always works, but we don't always see it immediately. It maybe helps in one way, maybe it opens one door, but there are more doors to open, maybe it'll take time. At the end, Hashem decides. So the fact that people say prayer with all intention, and you don't always see the decree being reversed, does not mean it didn't have an effect. We just don't know the effect, or we don't understand the effect. So of course this applies. It's not just the spirit. Remember, spiritual words is not just spiritual words. The prayer pierces heaven, and goes to a place that it draws down new energy that can transform a decree that may have been in place beforehand. I mean, it's no different if you think about it. Just like, let's say, medicine itself. A person may have, God forbid, an illness, and the medicine is strong enough to neutralize it and access a part of the immune system that makes the person stronger and heals. So how much more so God, Ani Hashem Refecha, that you can God do that through your prayers. Prayer in general, to heal him. Here the Gemara is saying, omein shmei rabba b'chol koichei. So the answer is yes. The person continues. In other places in Chassidus, I think it's taught that this could manifest in the physical world. There is a teaching that there was a chassid who was very overweight, but nobody in the community ever saw him eat excessively, so they wondered why he was overweight. And the Rebbe said he's overweight from saying omein yehei shmei rabba. Stories about Nochem Chernobyl, it's brought in Chassidus in Maimorim, that he was overweight. He was because of omein yehei shmei rabba. I don't know if it's connected to this, because there you could say the omein yehei shmei rabba, the pleasure that it caused him. His connection to Hashem physically had an effect, like we say, Shmur Teva Tadash and Etzem, the Gemara in Gittin. And when you hear a good piece of news, Tadash and Etzem, your very bone, your very physical being expands. That he couldn't fit the shoe on. Talk about Nero, that's what the Gemara talks about. He heard the pseudo that he was going to be the new emperor. So it physically made his body expand. His body literally got thicker. So the idea of omein yehei shmei rabba, you could say in that sense, actually had an effect on him, like for other people, food would have an effect. So I don't know if it relates to our discussion on Gzar Din, but I'm sure his omein yehei shmei rabba also had effects on the abolishing harsh decrees. One more question in this regard. How do we address doubts in the promises given to us after the tragedy in the UAE, in the United Arab Emirates, that happened 2 weeks ago? Tzvi Kogan, Hashem Yinkim Domov. How are we supposed to believe that Rebbe's promise that Shluchim are blessed with good begashmis beruchnis after this tragedy? Look, I don't have an answer for these questions. But remember, the Rebbe once said in the Fabrengen, Hamnuna is such that a question does not weaken and an answer doesn't strengthen. You believe in something. Tachlis emes doesn't always mean you understand. It means you're completely committed to the emes lamite. The Rebbe believed and saw many tragedies in his life, in his family. We all remember the sikh about Mrs. Lapine, Tafshinun Beis, a few weeks before the stroke. We don't have answers to these questions. And it's natural for a person to may have doubts and different thoughts creep in, but that's part of the battle of life. Because like the Rebbe says, doubts come from the other side. It's one of the ways the Nefesh Habam is Yetzer Hara finds ways to weaken our resolve. So if we believe in the Rebbe, and we believe in Shlichus, and we believe in Hashem's Keiches, so no matter what happens, that never gets weakened. That doesn't mean we're not challenged, and I'm not in any way going to criticize anyone that has questions. You have questions, ask the questions, surround yourself with people who have similar questions, but yet find deeper strength. The last thing you want is these questions to demoralize you, to paralyze you, to disorient you, to not allow you to forge ahead, as the Rebbe says many times. Even if we don't know why, we have to ask, what can we do? That's the question. We're not looking for answers, we're looking for strength. And that's the most direct answer I can give you. I'm not going to start finding excuses and explanations, because that, number one, doesn't help, and number two, it's not the approach. We don't know. We don't know the mysterious ways of God. Unfortunately, there have been setbacks. Remember Mumbai 16 years ago. And other similar tragedies, unfortunately. We should only have good news going forward. The best news is that we become stronger in the process and we fill the void by becoming more committed and fulfilling the work that he would have done many times over. That's our response. And perhaps that's a great segue into this week is going to be the dead day of Tes Kislev, which is actually tomorrow, 2 days rather, Tuesday, and the day following is Yud Kislev. So what are these days? Tes Kislev is both the birthday and the yahrzeit and yehei of the Mitteler Rebbe. Yud Kislev, a day after, is the geulah of the Mitteler Rebbe. One of the reasons that geulah did not take off like it's a Tes Kislev was because it happened the year before the Istalkus. So Yud Kislev, the year Tovkuv Pei Zayin, which is the year before the Mitteler Rebbe was nostalgic, was his geulah. He came out of prison. But next year, the first anniversary was the day after his passing. So they obviously didn't celebrate as you would usually celebrate. But now, after today, we celebrate both the fact that it's also his birthday. So it's the only Rebbe whose birthday and Stalkus are on the same day, like Moshe Rabbeinu. And by Tzadikim, the Gemara says, Chayet Tzadikim is the Eibush says Mamalish Neseim Yem Liyem, that their years are complete. So that means that they end their lives in this world the same day that they began. It's a complete cycle. The Rebbe explains why I don't find that by other tzaddikim, but that's unique. So we have the Mitteler Rebbe's Yem's geulah, his birthday, Mazali Gever, and all the keiches of the Mitteler Rebbe and all the Chassidus, called the Mitteler Rebbe the Cheves Hanar, the Binah of Chassidus. The Alter Rebbe being Chochma of Chassidus was more nekudas, shorter. The Mitteler Rebbe, you see that the Cheves is the expansion of it. And indeed, you see all the Sefarim. The Mitteler Rebbe published extensively Chassidus. In his lifetime, he made great Sefarim, and all the names of the Sefarim are connected to Binah one way or another. His classic Imre Binah. You have all the Sha'arim. We know Sha'arim is connected to Binah, Nun Shari Binah, Chamishim Sha'arim. So you have Sharat Shuvah, you have Sharat Tfilah, you have Shara Chanukah, Shari Eira, Shara Chanukah, and Shara Purim. And more Sha'arim, Shari Yichud, Shara Hamnuna, Shar, Binah. We see the Mitteler Rebbe, and indeed you see one page of the Alter Rebbe's Maimer by the Mitteler Rebbe could be 10 pages, sometimes even more. The Archava, the Cheves Hanar. So Chochm is compared more like Tamayan, like spring water, it's more drops. Even though the Rebbe, the Alter Rebbe itself, after coming out of prison, after Peterburg, his Mamorim became longer, but still, relative to the Mitteler Rebbe, it's still short. Still Nekudis. He developed all the Nekudis of Chassidus, the Sugis, the ideas of Chassidus, but the Mitteler Rebbe's Archava is very, very clear. So in the context of Afotzas Mayonas Chutz, of course, Archavim, Afotzas Mayonas Chutz, Afotza is Archava, spreading. So in that sense, that's what the Mitteler Rebbe represents. So when we're talking about the geulah of the Mitteler Rebbe, you're talking about the geulah even further than the geulah of Tes Kislev, as the Rebbe explains in a number of places. That if there's another geulah, it was not in the same thing, because the Alter Rebbe was already redeemed the fact that we are now ready to spread Chassidus in the form of Chassidus Chabad, explaining it. So in some places it says that the geulah of the Mitteler Rebbe was the kitrig there. The challenge was on Rebbe and Chassid. By the Alter Rebbe, the kitrig, the challenge was on Chassidus. That says in Beis Rebbe. But it's also that the Mitteler Rebbe, the expansion, the level of expansion that you saw with the Mitteler Rebbe's Chassidus is a whole different scale, literally in a different scale. So someone asked, I think the Rebbe once said that the liberation of the Mitteler Rebbe on Tes Kislev is on a much higher level than the Alter Rebbe's liberation on Tes Kislev. Can we ask Rabbi Jacobson to explain this? Thank you. So it's the difference between Chachma and Binah. Chachma is, of course, the spark of the idea, the Nekuda established the conceiving of the themes of Chassidus Chabad. And that was a Chiddush by the Alter Rebbe, was doing it in a way, explaining it even that the animal soul could understand, which means even if someone didn't have all the preparations, the famous example where they were arguing about whether he's doing the right thing or not, and then someone saw a blettel Chassidus, a page of Chassidus on the floor, and he said, you see, people are not appreciating it. Once upon a time, you taught Primis Atei Tichidus geulah to individuals who appreciate it. Here it's just Valgenzach on the floor. It means no, people are not appreciating. And the Alter Rebbe gave the famous mashal of the ben chela, of the child who got very sick, deathly sick. The doctors had given up hope. They couldn't find any solution. Till one remote doctor said that, from a remote city came and said that if you take the most precious stone of the king's crown and you crush it, turn it into powder, you mix it with water, that may be an elixir, a healing force that can, if you can get it, even a drop between the clenched teeth of the comatose child, it may save him. And much of it will drop on the floor, like the page of Chassidus. But so the king said, no doubt, no question, this is my son. The Yidden at the time were in a comatose state spiritually. So Chassidus was a lifesaver. It wasn't just an optional thing. So that was the challenge. Is that the correct path? The Mitteler Rebbe Binah was a whole other thing. Of taking Chassidus and now explaining it in such breadth and such expansiveness that the animal soul can fully understand it. That was a very different challenge. And you have to say it was a bigger challenge because the vindication of the Alter Rebbe was there already. So the fact that there's still a golus and a geulah was not for technical reasons, that there means something in heaven, means that there was something even deeper. To really bring Chassidus to the fullest sense to every person, everywhere, like Recheves Hanor, spreading of the river. That's one of the explanations given. And therefore Yud Kislev is the geulah of that. Why is the Mitteler Rebbe called the Mitteler Rebbe if he was the second Rebbe of the dynasty of 7 Rebbes? Wouldn't it make more sense mathematically for the 4th Rebbe, the Rebbe Marash, to be called the Mitteler Rebbe? So the technical reason is because this name came to him during the time of the Tzemach Tzedek. So Tzemach Tzedek was the Rebbe, the Alter Rebbe was the grandfather, was the first Rebbe, and the Mitteler Rebbe is the middle. The Alter Rebbe, Mitteler Rebbe, Tzemach Tzedek. The question has to be asked is, what about today? Today is no longer the Mitteler because we have Rebbes afterwards. So I've not seen an answer. I'm not surprised if we find something in the Rebbe's Sichos about it, whether what Mitteler Rebbe means in that sense, that still we call him Mitteler. We could say Chabad, Chochma, Binah, Das. Of course, Binah is the middle between Chochma and Das of the Alter Rebbe and the Tzemach Tzedek, which is also today, being the middle of the Moichin, of the Gimel Moichin. Again, I have not seen, if anybody has something on this from a Rebbe's letter, an answer, or a Sikha, please share it with me, and I'd love to share it with our listeners. And then we can maybe elaborate once we know what the meaning behind that is. Okay. Another question, can we ask Rabbi Jacobson to give a brief synopsis of the book Pokeach Ivrim that the Mitteler Rebbe wrote for a Baal Tshuva to know the proper path to take? So Pokeach Ivrim means literally to open up the eyes of the blind. So we know the Mitteler Rebbe wrote Svarim. As I said, he published Svarim, he published the Siddur, where he gathered all the Maimorim that he wrote of the Alter Rebbe saying throughout the years, in the order on the Siddur and on Yom Tevim. He published many Svarim, and some I mentioned before, but some of them were actually written, designated because of a certain individual. Pokeach Ivrim was a certain Baal Tshuva who had a terrible sin, and they did Tshuva, and the Mitteler Rebbe wrote a sefer dedicated to him. So the theme of it is essentially Tshuva, and Pokeach Ivrim indicates and hints to that. You can be blind, and then the eyes are opened. So he talks about Tshuva. That's the central theme of it. The details I suggest opening up, there are today English translations that you can read of it. There's some overlap with Derech Chaim, which, by the way, Chaim is also connected to Binah, and Derech, which is connected to, which has about Tshuva, connected to Aseret Simei Tshuva. And And that's the bottom line. Someone else writes, what was the Mitteler Rebbe's magnum opus? Well, we know magnum opus is a big statement. The Alter Rebbe, of course, we'd say Tanya, Shulchan Aruch. Mitteler Rebbe, generally speaking, Imre Binah is considered to be his, like, I guess, classic. I don't want to call it magnum opus because I don't want to say anything definitive. In some places it says that Sharei Yichud is the I think it says is the Aleph Beis of Chassidus, and Sharei Hamnuna is the Mafteach of Chassidus, and one of them is the Aleph Beis of Chassidus. I remember the details right now. So it's hard to designate something, but Imre Binah is definitely a classic in the sense that it's very, very profound and very deep and touches upon the whole sugyas of Chassidus. But that's the most I could say about that. Yeah. So a few more things about the Mitteler Rebbe. There's a story. Someone writes, there's a story that when the Mitteler Rebbe felt the harsh decree was being written in heaven, he asked his orchestra to go to the street and play music as a group of Chassidim, including his son Reb Nochem, rode their horses down the street and did tricks with the horses to entertain people and bring them joy. He said he asked everyone to do this because joy can soften a harsh decree. Is there a relationship between joy softening a decree and the Rebbe Rashab quoting Shabbos 119b that we discussed earlier, that it says, one says, omein shmei rabba, with all their might, it softens harsh decrees? Or are these two separate methods to soften harsh decrees? I have not seen a connection between the two. Obviously, when you say omein shmei rabba, you should do it with simcha as well. But simcha paired together. Simcha has the ability, in its own right, to pierce heavens and to break down barriers, and therefore also the harsh decrees. Now you could ask why we use one or both. I mean, listen, frankly, if there's a harsh decree, God forbid, do both. Say omein shmei rabba b'chol keichei, with all the might, with all the kavanah, and also simcha. So I don't see it as two different approaches. And I'm sure, I didn't look it up, but in my Chazal you'll find other expressions about being mevatel gzar din, and we see it in different ways. People do it through tilim, they do it through fasting, different things to eliminate, abolish a harsh decree. But it's fitting to our discussion. And finally, since we're talking about that, let's just speak about a few more questions on this. Was the generation of the Mitteler Rebbe the most fun and joyous of the 7 generations of Chabad? Firstly, let's not use those terms. I don't know, fun and joyous. Joyous, yes. Fun, I don't know if that word I would use. Is it the most joyous? I'm not sure why you would say that. I mean, Binah ema bonim smecha, so you could say Binah is connected to simcha. But let's see how this person continues. I'm not saying the Mitteler Rebbe wasn't serious at the appropriate times, and I'm not saying the other Rebbeim weren't joyous at appropriate times. But from the stories written about the Mitteler Rebbe, that he had a marching band that would travel with him, he had jesters in his court that would uplift people with jokes, he had a group of horse riders that would entertain the children. Sometimes while traveling, he would stop the wagon and ask the children to dance in the street and make somersaults. It seems to me that during the Mitteler Rebbe's tenure, the Aveda was that of connecting to godliness through joy in a manner of simcha peiris geder. Would it be okay if we tried to recreate some of that today to help break through the boundaries? I'm no acrobat, but I would be willing to try doing a few somersaults in order to bring joy to everyone in my shul, and with the hope that through joy we can crash through any obstacles and boundaries holding us back from achieving our goals of getting the hostages safely returned and spreading godliness in the world until everyone unanimously agrees to live peacefully together in order to welcome Mashiach's full revelation. So, okay, interesting question. I will say, being someone living in the Deir Ashvi, the Rebbe, look at the amount of simcha that Rebbe introduced. I'm not even talking now about the Rebbe simcha himself, simcha stera and Purim and other times, but the simcha that he would always make with his hands, and times leading songs, and always encouraging people to be besimcha. Of course, the children in Tzivus Hashem, the Lag B'Omer parades, children's simcha, the constant encouragement of that. The Rebbe speaking in the later years, he speaks that Eina Dovber Tolei Ela B'Simcha, that we should add in simcha to bring the geulah. So I don't know if you could make these comparisons. It's true, the Mitteler Rebbe did it his way. The Rebbe didn't do it necessarily in that way. There's many ways to add in simcha. We know that Rabbi Shmuel Munkus was if you want to call it a court jester, we don't call him a jester, but he also made Lebedik in his time, in the Alter Rebbe's time. So I think in every generation, simcha, especially Chassidus, is so fundamentally based on simcha. Simcha was also always a foundational thing. So I don't want to go into more or less. If you find the Mitteler Rebbe, absolutely, let's learn from that, especially now coming to Tes and Kislev, and let's absolutely create as much joy as possible, especially knowing how much the Rebbeim emphasize it. In Tanya, of course, simcha, the entire Parakim on Tanya, starting from Perek Chavov and on. And all the Maimorim of simcha is a tremendous yesod in Teres Baal Shem Tov and Chassidus in general. And we'll conclude with one more question. We just had a baby, and the bris will be on the day of the Mitteler Rebbe's birthday. I want to name my son Hamnuna, to honor the original name the Alter Rebbe wanted to choose for the Mitteler Rebbe before the Maggid asked him to choose the name Dovber. My wife wants Dovber. She says if the Alter Rebbe chose Dovber, then ultimately he knew what he was doing. I feel there are a lot of Dovbers already in the community honoring the Mitteler Rebbe, and I feel bad for Rabbi Hamnuna, who is a big tzaddik, and who was quoted many times in the Zohar. And he didn't get the opportunity to have the Mitteler Rebbe named after him. Perhaps my wife and I should compromise and name our son Dovber Hamnuna. Well, if you're asking me, my opinion is I would defer to your wife. First of all, you know you're on safe ground. A Rebbe is called Dovber, so to call him Dovber is the right way to go. The fact that we know that story, yes, but I didn't see anywhere. And I'm wondering if what the Rebbe would tell you. I didn't see any Rebbeim, and they were probably more committed and respectful of Rabbi Hamnuna than all of us put together. Not probably, for sure. And they didn't go ahead to say we have to honor him that way. There are many ways to honor him. Maybe learn his Torah, learn the Zohar, learn other places where Rabbi Hamnuna is quoted. But as far as naming goes, I would stay with what we know for sure, certainly, to name him after Dovber. That's my opinion, and since you're asking, that's what I would say to you. In addition, you'll also be showing that Ish Adam is Machabed Ishte Yesem Agufei. You honor your wife more than yourself, and your wife maybe has the instincts, the right instincts here. I'm not criticizing your consideration. It's interesting and creative, but at the end of the day, I would name him Dovber, only Dovber. And one more question, since someone asked, do we know why the Rebbe said Kaddish on the 10th of Kislev? So the Rebbe several times a year said Kaddish. A few times we're not sure what was the reason. We did find out Isra Chag Simchas Torah, the reason was ultimately for his grandmother Rachel, who was killed by the Nazis. Hashem Yimkom Damera. Tes Kislev, I think the speculation is, and I think today we know because the Rebbe may have written it on one of the calendars, that it was because of his brother, whose name was Dovber. The Rebbe's youngest brother was Dovber, who was Rachmana litzlan killed by Yimach Shemam, the Nazis. And being that Yud Kislev is the Chag HaGeulah of the Mitteler Rebbe, the speculation was always, and I think today it's definite because the Rebbe wrote it somewhere, that it was for his brother. So, with that, it's a good place to conclude this program of MyLife Chassidus Applied. Everyone should have a very freilichen and geulah dika Tes Kislev, and may we indeed abolish all the harsh decrees through simcha, through our tefillas, through omein shmei rabba, and may we finally see the fruition of the fulfillment of all the prophecies and all the predictions and all the descriptions of the narrative coming to an end with the fall of the enemies and the rise of Mashiach Tzidkenu, the geulah hamitis v'ashlema. Everyone be well. We're here every Sunday, 8 to 9 p.m. Kol Tuv, and again, a freilichen and a geulah dika Tes Kislev.
This program is brought to you by MyLife Chassidus Applied. Please help us continue our programs. Make even a small contribution at chassidusapply.com/donate.